June 9th, 1886. The last night on the North Island of New Zealand, winter has settled over the lake. The air is cold, the water is still. From the hillside above the shore, slow columns of steam drift upward into the dark, the same way they have drifted every night for centuries. Nobody on that shore is afraid. There is no reason to be. The mountain behind the lake has not made a sound in 572 years. What stands on that hillside has been called the eighth wonder of the world. Visitors have crossed entire oceans specifically to stand in front of it. Painters have camped on its shores for weeks, trying to capture it, then written in their journals that no pigment existed for what they were seeing. The closest anyone ever came to describing it in words was a visitor who stood at its base, looked up, and wrote that it was grand enough to serve as the steps to heaven. He was not being poetic, he simply ran out of language. A staircase of crystallized silica, 50 wide, scallop steps descending 30 meters, about 98 feet, into the lake below. Each step holds a pool. The pools at the top are near boiling. The pools at the bottom are warm enough to swim in. The water is the color of glacial ice, and the silica face is white, pure, unbroken white, the white of something that has never been touched by anything that could stain it. Across the lake, half a mile of open water away, its twin shimmers in the dark, smaller tinted salmon and rose and pink, its upper pools a blue so clear that no painter could replicate it. Together they are the largest silica formations ever known to exist anywhere on this planet. Tonight they are still here. The steam is still rising. The water is still warm. In 6 hours they will be gone. But something happened 11 days before this night that nobody on that shore has been able to explain. Something appeared on the lake, something that had no business being there. Two separate groups of witnesses saw it. The guides called out. There was no response. It vanished into the mist as if it had never existed. An elderly Maori priest heard what had been seen and immediately warned that something terrible was coming. Days later, he would be buried beneath the eruption he believed the canoe had foretold, and he would survive. When the mountain finally erupted, it destroyed the terraces through a mechanism volcanologists once believed was impossible. More than a century later, scientists are still studying Tarawera to understand how it happened. For 125 years, the world believed the terraces had been completely destroyed. Then robot submarines exploring the floor of the lake found large sections still there, lying beneath roughly 200 feet of water. The story everyone thought had ended had quietly begun again. Tonight we're returning to the final night of the Pink and White Terraces to uncover what they really were, what destroyed them, and why one of the greatest natural wonders ever known may not be as lost as the world once believed. Before we do, if you enjoy content like this, hit the like button and subscribe. And if you are willing to share, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from today, and what is the time over there? I love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now, let's return to the evening before the mountain woke up. Across New Zealand's North Island, the landscape appears settled, with forests, lakes, and rolling hills stretching across a country shaped by rain and time. Beneath that familiar surface, another landscape exists, one that never stops changing. Rock bends, fractures widen, and heat gathers far below the reach of daylight. The ground itself is slowly pulling apart, creating one of the most active volcanic regions anywhere on Earth. This broad belt is known as the Taupo Volcanic Zone, extending for about 135 miles across the island, where deep geological forces remain in constant motion. The separation happens at a pace almost impossible to notice, only about 1/3 of an inch each year. Even so, that gradual movement carries enormous consequences. As the crust stretches, it becomes thinner than much of the surrounding continents. In some places, it measures only about 6 miles thick, leaving molten rock unusually close to the surface. Heat escapes more easily through these weakened layers, feeding countless hot springs, steaming valleys, boiling pools, and volcanic mountains scattered across the region. Far below those features lies something much larger than any individual volcano. A broad body of magma extends for roughly 19 miles in width and nearly 62 miles in length. It behaves less like a collection of isolated chambers and more like an interconnected network where changes in one area can influence another many miles away. Energy moves through this system over centuries, sometimes with little outward sign, until pressure gradually finds a path upward through fractures in the crust. Mount Tarawera formed within this restless environment. It is a chain of lava domes rising into three principal summits: Wahenga, Ruahaya, and Tarawera Dome. These peaks were built largely from rhyolite, a thick volcanic rock rich in dissolved gases. Unlike the smoother flows of more fluid lava, rhyolite tends to trap expanding gases until tremendous pressure accumulates. That property explains why eruptions involving rhyolite often become violently explosive after long periods of apparent calm. The mountain had demonstrated that power once before. Around 1314, during what geologists call the Kaharoa eruption, Tarawera expelled between 3 and 4 cubic miles of volcanic material across the surrounding countryside. Early Maori communities almost certainly witnessed that event, carrying its memory through oral tradition for generations. Afterward, however, the volcano settled into an extraordinary period of inactivity. Year followed year, then century followed century. 572 years passed without another eruption, allowing forests to spread across its slopes and communities to grow with little reason to expect another catastrophe. At the mountain's base rested Lake Rotomahana, its waters warmed from below by the same geothermal engine that sustained the wider volcanic field. Heat rising through underground fractures carried dissolved silica toward the surface, creating conditions found almost nowhere else on Earth. Along the lake's edge, that mineral rich water slowly constructed the pink and white terraces, adding delicate crystalline layers through thousands of uninterrupted years. Everything above the surface seemed separate, the mountain standing apart from the lake, the terraces appearing as peaceful works of nature shaped over immense spans of time. In truth, every feature belonged to one living geological system: the warmth filling the pools, the steam drifting into the winter air, and the mountain overlooking them all drew strength from the same reservoir of heat, one that had labored for 7,000 years and was approaching its final hours before everything changed. Nothing about the pink and white terraces suggested that human hands had ever shaped them. Every ledge, every rim, every basin emerged through a patient geological process measured in thousands of years. Layer after layer accumulated so gradually that no visitor could ever have watched the landscape change with the naked eye. Each new surface formed from dissolved silica carried upward in heated groundwater, leaving behind an ever thickening shell as the water spread across the hillside and cooled in the open air. The mineral responsible for this transformation is the same substance found in quartz, glass, and common sand. Deep underground, groundwater absorbs silica while circulating through intensely heated rock. As that water reached the surface, escaping pressure and cooler air caused the dissolved mineral to crystallize. A coating thinner than the width of a human hair settled onto the existing surface. Another followed, then another, repeating across countless generations until broad terraces emerged where there had once been ordinary rock. The larger of the two formations was the White Terrace, known in Maori as Te Tirata, meaning the tattooed rock. At its summit, a boiling spring poured water from a crater perched about 98 feet above Lake Rotomahana. The flow descended across 50 broad steps, each one edged by creamy white silica that curved into graceful basins. Water entering from above approached the boiling point, then cooled little by little as it crossed each level, allowing visitors to choose pools with different temperatures during their ascent or descent. Its dimensions matched its reputation. The White Terrace stretched across an area comparable to 7 football fields. Near the lake, it reached about 280 feet in width, while the stepped face extended nearly 790 feet across the hillside. Across the water stood its companion, Tūhoto Ariki, the Pink Terrace, whose Maori name translates as the Fountain of the Clouded Sky. Smaller in scale, it possessed an entirely different character. Clear blue pools rested above silica stained with shades of rose and salmon, produced by dissolved iron, manganese, and perhaps communities of heat loving microorganisms flourishing where few forms of life could survive. European knowledge of the terraces began when Ernst Diefenbach described them during the early 1840s. His published accounts traveled across the British Empire and inspired decades of visitors willing to undertake demanding journeys by horseback, boat, and long stretches on foot. Travelers arrived from England, Australia, the United States, and continental Europe, considering the destination an essential stop during extended tours through the southern colonies. Distinguished guests soon followed, including Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, the novelist Anthony Trollope, colonial governors, and wealthy industrialists. Hotels appeared at nearby Tarawera to serve the growing stream of visitors. A flour mill, schoolhouse, and general store supported a settlement shaped by tourism as much as local life. At the center of nearly every excursion stood Sophia Hinerangi, celebrated for her knowledge, language skills, and years of guiding people across the geothermal landscape. Artists found themselves lingering for weeks, convinced that a single visit could never capture the forms before them. Charles Blumfield devoted more than 6 weeks to painting the terraces, while photographers preserved their contours in fragile prints. Even so, no image fully conveyed their scale. Nowhere else on Earth had geothermal activity assembled silica terraces of such size, complexity, and age. They rose from the flank of an active volcano, their beauty and their existence sustained by the same geological force. Morning arrived on the 31st of May, 1886, with nothing to separate it from the many journeys that had come before. Visitors gathered for another crossing toward the celebrated terraces, trusting the experienced Maori guides who knew every bend of the lake and every change in the weather. Among them was Sophia Hinerangi, whose reputation had grown through years of leading travelers across these waters. She had completed this route so many times that even the smallest change in the landscape rarely escaped her attention. Before anything unusual appeared, she noticed the behavior of the lake itself. The waterline shifted in a manner unfamiliar to those who depended upon it every day. It rose, then settled again, without a strong wind or passing storm to account for the movement. Modern volcanology offers a possible explanation. Far below the lake floor, fractures may already have been opening as molten rock forced its way upward through the crust. Pressure changes within the underground system could have disturbed the basin long before any eruption reached the surface. As the boats continued across the lake, another shape entered the morning haze. A large Maori war canoe emerged at a distance, its outline becoming clearer as it advanced. Witnesses described two ordered rows of occupants. One group paddled with steady rhythm, while another stood upright, wrapped in traditional flax garments. Their heads remained lowered. Feathers from the huia and the white heron adorned their hair, decorations associated with the honored dead in Maori custom. The guides raised their voices toward the approaching canoe, expecting the ordinary exchange that travelers shared on the lake. No reply came back. The paddlers maintained their course without acknowledgement, and the vessel continued across the water before fading once more into the drifting mist. Those watching remained fixed on the place where it had vanished, waiting for it to emerge again. It never did. This account survives because more than one group reported it. Two separate tourist boats recorded seeing the same extraordinary sight from different positions on the lake. One passenger, Josiah Martin, later produced a sketch based on what he had witnessed. Newspapers across New Zealand carried reports of the encounter only days later, preserving it as a contemporary historical record instead of a story remembered many years afterward. Searches for an ordinary explanation found little to satisfy every detail. No war canoe matching that description was known to operate on Lake Tarawera during that period. Local communities could not identify its crew or account for its presence. Decades later, researchers suggested that unusual atmospheric conditions might have produced a mirage. Another proposal imagined that geological disturbances had lifted an old ceremonial canoe from the lake floor before it drifted out of sight. Each idea addressed part of the mystery while leaving important observations unresolved. Independent witnesses consistently described the same arrangement of people, the same ceremonial feathers, and the same absence of any response after repeated calls. Those shared details gave the event unusual historical weight. Sophia Hinerangi carried the account to Tūhoto Ariki, the tohunga of her community, seeking his understanding of what had crossed the lake that morning. From that conversation, the story moved beyond an unexplained sighting and entered the cultural memory of New Zealand, preserved in both written history and Maori tradition. Age had given Tūhoto Ariki a place unlike anyone else in the district. People who met him understood they were speaking with someone whose life reached far beyond ordinary memory. Contemporary accounts estimated that he was between 100 and 110 years old during 1886. If those estimates were close to the truth, he had lived through a span connecting generations before widespread European settlement with a rapidly changing colonial world. Stories preserved by his ancestors had become part of his own living memory, carried forward through careful repetition instead of written records. Within the Tuarangi community, Tūhoto Ariki served as the tohunga, a spiritual authority whose responsibilities extended beyond ceremony. He interpreted signs in the natural world, guarded sacred traditions, advised families during important decisions, and preserved knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Mountains, lakes, forests, and geothermal springs were understood as places possessing their own spiritual relationships with the people who lived among them. Events in nature could therefore carry meaning that reached beyond their physical appearance. When Sophia Hinerangi described the canoe seen upon the lake, Tūhoto Ariki answered without hesitation. He identified it as a waka wairua, a spirit canoe traveling between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. Its occupants, in his understanding, were not ordinary travelers crossing the water. They were souls already gathering for deaths that had not yet occurred. The feathers worn upon their heads matched traditional customs associated with mourning and remembrance, strengthening his conviction that the sighting belonged to the spiritual realm instead of everyday life. His interpretation reached further than the canoe itself. Tūhoto Ariki believed the appearance carried a warning about the relationship between people and the land around Lake Rotomahana. The Pink and White Terraces were treasured gifts inherited from earlier generations. Visitors from distant countries had transformed those sacred places into celebrated destinations, bringing prosperity to nearby settlements. From his perspective, commercial success had gradually weakened older customs surrounding tapu, the sacred principles governing respect, conduct, and responsibility. Opening treasured places to outsiders without maintaining those traditions disturbed a balance that had existed for generations. He told those around him that a great calamity was approaching. Preparations should begin while time remained. The warning entered conversations throughout the community, yet daily life continued. Te Wairoa stood as a prosperous village supported by hotels, shops, farms, and the steady arrival of travelers eager to visit the famous terraces. Businesses welcomed guests arriving from across the world. Families cared for homes and children. Work followed familiar routines. Within that setting, a prophecy from an elderly spiritual leader carried profound meaning for many Maori families, though it did not provide enough certainty to halt ordinary life across the settlement. Historical records preserve both the warning and what followed with unusual clarity. 11 days after the phantom canoe crossed the lake, during the early hours of June 10th, 1886, Mount Tarawera erupted. Later generations looked back upon Tūhoto Ariki's words with extraordinary attention because the sequence of events appeared to match his prediction so closely. When the eruption struck, he remained inside his own house as volcanic debris buried the surrounding land. Walls collapsed around him, and ash sealed the structure from the outside world. His survival became one of the most enduring accounts connected with the disaster, joining history, cultural tradition, and lived experience in a story remembered long after the mountain changed forever. Memory shapes the way people read a landscape. A river that has always followed the same course seems dependable. A forest visited through many seasons feels familiar. A mountain standing unchanged through generation after generation slowly becomes part of the background of ordinary life. Mount Tarawera occupied that place in the minds of those living nearby during the winter of 1886. It was respected, admired, and woven into daily existence, yet almost no one regarded it as an immediate danger. Its last eruption had occurred around 1314, more than 572 years earlier. That span exceeded the lifetime of any family tradition carried through direct experience. Maori communities preserved accounts of the Kaharoa eruption through oral history, passing them carefully from one generation to another, though those stories described a distant past instead of a living memory. European settlers possessed even less context. They had arrived centuries after the mountain's previous awakening and knew Tarawera only as a familiar landmark overlooking lakes, forests, and geothermal valleys. The region itself encouraged that sense of acceptance. Steam drifted from vents throughout the North Island. Mud pools bubbled, hot springs released mineral-rich water, and the smell of sulfur belonged to everyday life. Travelers often describe these geothermal features with fascination, considering them attractions instead of warnings. The celebrated terraces owed their existence to the same underground heat, reinforcing the impression that volcanic energy could create beauty as readily as it produced destruction. Even so, subtle changes had begun appearing across the landscape. Residents noticed unusual movement in Lake Tarawera as water levels rose and fell without an obvious cause. Nearby geothermal fields became more active than many people remembered. Mud pools splashed with greater force, while familiar springs seemed warmer than before. Visitors recorded these details in journals, treating them as curious observations collected during an extraordinary journey across New Zealand, rather than evidence of a developing geological crisis. Small earthquakes also passed through the Rotorua district during the days leading toward the eruption. Around 30 tremors were reported, although many proved so slight that only attentive observers recognized them. In an area already known for geothermal activity, occasional shaking did not stand apart from ordinary experience. Few imagined that each tremor reflected pressure building through the crust as molten rock searched for a path toward the surface. Scientific understanding offered little assistance at the time. Instruments capable of detecting subtle ground movement, measuring volcanic gases, or recording detailed seismic activity had not yet become part of volcanic monitoring. Observation depended almost entirely upon human senses. People watched the landscape, compared what they noticed with what they already believed, and reached conclusions shaped by familiar experience. The signs themselves were genuine. Their meaning remained hidden behind expectations formed during centuries of apparent stability. Deep underground, a vertical sheet of molten basalt continued advancing through fractured rock. Each upward movement disturbed groundwater, widened cracks, and redistributed pressure through the volcanic system. None of that motion revealed itself directly to those living above. Fields, homes, hotels, and villages remained occupied as another winter night settled across the region. Around 1 o'clock, during the morning of June 10th, the pattern shifted. The earthquakes strengthened enough that they could no longer be dismissed as ordinary tremors. Windows rattled, buildings responded to the movement, and the ground carried a different rhythm than before. The long interval of apparent certainty had reached its final moments, though almost everyone experiencing those vibrations still believed dawn would arrive like every other dawn they had ever known. At about 2 o'clock in the morning on June 10th, 1886, the darkness above Mount Tarawera changed in a single instant. A deep crimson glow burst across the summit, spreading upward until the mountain seemed to carry its own sunrise. People who had lived for years beneath those slopes woke to a light that belonged neither to dawn nor to the moon. It came from the earth itself, announcing that the long hidden movement below the surface had finally broken through. For days, a vertical sheet of molten basalt had forced its way upward through fractured rock. Geologists call this structure a basaltic dike, a blade of magma advancing through the crust by breaking the surrounding stone apart. As pressure increased, the fracture reached the crest of the mountain almost simultaneously across its three principal peaks. Wahanga opened first in the north. Ruawahia followed at the highest point of the range, rising about 3,645 feet above sea level, and Tarawera Dome split open farther south. Instead of a single volcanic cone erupting from one crater, the mountain tore along its spine. The rupture expanded with astonishing speed. Glowing fragments of molten rock, known as tephra, blasted upward from the widening crack. Dense fountains of incandescent scoria climbed nearly 6 miles into the atmosphere before beginning their descent. Within the rising eruption column, countless particles collided at tremendous speed. Those impacts separated electrical charges until brilliant flashes of lightning flickered again and again through the ash cloud, turning the volcanic plume into its own storm. Across the countryside, eyewitnesses began recording the same extraordinary scene from very different places. In Te Wairoa, about 8 miles from the summit, 12-year-old Willie Bennett awoke as violent shaking spread through the village. Many decades later, he described the eruption during an interview broadcast by the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation, preserving the memory of that night through his own words. His recollections became one of the most valuable first-hand accounts from someone who experienced the opening moments as a child. Farther away in Rotorua, roughly 15 miles from the mountain, Postmaster Roger Dancy looked from his home and saw an immense pillar of fire rising into the darkness. He carefully documented what he witnessed, creating another detailed historical record that later researchers compared with many other observations. Even at that distance, the eruption dominated the horizon with startling clarity. Beyond the coastline, about 75 miles offshore in the Bay of Plenty, Captain Stevenson watched from the deck of his ship as fiery bursts climbed above the distant land. He later described glowing masses that appeared to separate into showers resembling bright stars before disappearing into the ash. The sound carried even farther than the light. Reports placed the explosions as far as 260 miles away, reaching beyond the northern end of the South Island and echoing across Cook Strait. While people struggled to understand what they were hearing and seeing, the fracture itself continued extending through the crust. Each passing minute lengthened the volcanic tear as it advanced southwestward, following the underground pathway carved by the rising magma toward Lake Rotomahana, where another chapter of the eruption was already taking shape. The fracture racing along Mount Tarawera did not stop at the summit. After cutting through the mountain's crest, it continued its journey toward the geothermal basin surrounding Lake Rotomahana. The same underground pathway that had supplied warmth and mineral-rich water for thousands of years now became the route through which molten rock advanced. At about 3:20 in the morning on June 10th, 1886, that advancing magma reached the hydrothermal system responsible for creating the famous terraces. Everything changed within moments of that contact. Molten basalt encountered groundwater trapped under tremendous pressure inside fractures, porous rock, and underground reservoirs. Geologists describe this process as a phreatomagmatic eruption. The term combines an ancient Greek word for a well with the word magma, describing an eruption driven by the violent meeting of water and molten rock. The destructive force came less from flowing lava than from the extraordinary physical behavior of water when exposed to extreme heat. Liquid water transformed into steam almost instantly. During that transition, its volume expanded to roughly 1,700 times greater than before. Underground, there was nowhere for that expanding steam to spread gradually. Confined by surrounding rock, pressure accumulated with astonishing speed until the overlying ground could no longer contain it. The release happened in explosive pulses that shattered solid rock into countless fragments while throwing ash, steam, volcanic debris, and broken earth high into the atmosphere. The surface above Lake Rotomahana responded with overwhelming violence. Entire sections of ground were blasted apart instead of opening through a single vent. Every explosion excavated fresh cavities that immediately allowed additional groundwater to contact rising magma, feeding another cycle of rapid steam expansion. The process repeated again and again across the geothermal field, producing an eruption unlike the lava flows many people associate with volcanoes. One of the most dangerous products of those explosions was the formation of pyroclastic surges. These dense currents contained scorching gases, steam, pulverized rock, and volcanic ash moving together as one turbulent mass. They swept outward at speeds approaching 130 feet each second, crossing the landscape faster than any person could escape on foot. A lead of only a few moments offered almost no protection once one of these surges had formed. Their destructive power extended beyond speed alone. Temperatures within the advancing clouds were sufficient to ignite vegetation almost immediately, and even soften or melt glass. The heat reached deadly levels before direct flames ever appeared, while airborne ash and shattered stone struck everything in their path. Structures, forests, and living communities faced forces that combined crushing pressure, searing temperatures, and overwhelming momentum within the same advancing front. The Pink and White Terraces stood directly above the center of this unfolding process. They did not disappear beneath advancing lava. Instead, the very hydrothermal system that had built them became the source of their destruction. Explosions shattered the silica formations into fragments, while collapsing ground removed the hillside on which they had rested for 7,000 years. Much of the surrounding landscape vanished into newly formed craters before water reclaimed the devastated basin. Lake Rotomahana itself changed almost beyond recognition. The eruption excavated a vast depression, throwing sections of the original lake floor into the air before water gradually filled the enlarged basin. By the time volcanic activity subsided, the lake covered roughly 20 times its former area. Where visitors had once admired broad white steps descending toward warm pools, there now remained a crater nearly 300 feet deep, occupied by the expanding waters of a transformed lake, holding within it the shattered remains of one of Earth's most extraordinary natural creations. By about 3:30 in the morning, the eruption had grown into something larger than the mountain itself. Across the surrounding countryside, volcanic ash began falling with astonishing intensity. In the hardest hit areas, more than 10 inches accumulated in a single minute. The ash was mixed with moisture and volcanic debris, making it far heavier than ordinary dust. Roofs built to withstand years of weather yielded beneath the sudden weight. Homes that had sheltered families for decades collapsed within moments, trapping many of those who had sought protection inside. Te Wairoa stood about 8 miles from Mount Tarawera, close enough to endure relentless ashfall, yet far enough to escape the first destructive surges that swept across the geothermal basin. Among its buildings was the traditional Maori house belonging to Sophia Hinerangi. Constructed with exceptional strength, it became a refuge as frightened residents and visitors crowded together beneath its roof. More than 60 people gathered inside, remaining there while the earth shook and volcanic debris continued piling higher outside. The building endured the assault, preserving the lives of most who had reached its shelter before the surrounding structures failed. Other families were far less fortunate. Schoolmaster Charles Hassard led members of his household into the village schoolhouse, believing its walls would withstand the storm outside. They waited together as ash accumulated across the roof. Eventually, the weight became too great. The building collapsed, killing Charles, his young son, 2 daughters, and a nephew. His eldest daughter, Clara, survived the disaster. Many years afterward, she painted scenes from that terrible night, leaving behind one of the most personal visual records created by someone who had lived through the eruption as a child. Communities closer to Lake Rotomahana faced an entirely different fate. The settlements of Te Ariki, Mora, Totorariki, Te Tapahoro, and Waingongongo lay directly within the path of the phreatomagmatic explosions described by modern volcanology. Before heavy ash could bury those villages, fast-moving pyroclastic surges swept across the landscape. These dense currents of heated gas, shattered rock, and volcanic ash arrived with overwhelming speed. Many people never had an opportunity to seek meaningful shelter. Entire settlements disappeared within minutes, and in some villages, no survivors remained to describe what had happened. As daylight should have approached, darkness still covered the region. Thick volcanic ash blocked the morning sun so completely that dawn failed to brighten the sky. The eruption continued for approximately 6 hours before its greatest violence gradually diminished around 6 o'clock. Even then, the transformed landscape remained almost impossible to recognize. Familiar roads, cultivated fields, and village boundaries had vanished beneath deep layers of fresh volcanic deposits. Rescue parties organized in Rotorua began traveling toward the devastated communities despite the darkness, unstable ground, and continuing ashfall. Progress proved painfully slow. Fallen trees, collapsed buildings, and deep volcanic mud obstructed nearly every route. Those who reached Te Wairoa discovered roofs crushed flat, fences buried, and homes reduced to uneven mounds rising from gray ash. The final number of lives lost has never been established with complete certainty. Most historical estimates place the death toll between 108 and 120 people. It remains the deadliest volcanic disaster in New Zealand's recorded history and the greatest volcanic loss of life the country had experienced in the previous 5 centuries. The eruption altered landscapes, erased villages, and transformed individual lives into names preserved through memory, paintings, official records, and the stories carried forward by those who survived. Once the eruption had ended and the landscape became accessible again, geologists began examining the deposits left behind. They expected the evidence to match familiar volcanic patterns. Instead, the layers of ash, shattered rock, and scoria pointed towards something that challenged established understanding. The mountain had produced an eruption whose behavior refused to fit comfortably within the categories scientists relied upon to explain explosive volcanism. The largest eruption columns on Earth are usually associated with rhyolite, a thick, sticky magma rich in silica. Because it flows so poorly, gases dissolved within it struggle to escape. Pressure continues building until the magma fragments violently, launching ash and volcanic debris high into the atmosphere. Such eruptions are known as Plinian eruptions, named after the account written after the destruction of the Roman cities surrounding Mount Vesuvius. Similar eruptive styles have also been documented at Krakatoa, Mount Pinatubo, and other famous volcanoes whose towering ash clouds became defining moments in geological history. Mount Tarawera did not erupt rhyolite. The eruption that tore open the summit was driven primarily by basalt, a magma very different in composition and behavior. Basalt contains much less silica and usually flows with relative ease. Dissolved gases escape more readily, reducing the enormous pressure buildup associated with classic Plinian eruptions. Around the world, basalt commonly produces lava flows, lava lakes, and spectacular fountains of molten rock. Those are dramatic events, yet they generally do not create sustained ash columns rising many miles into the atmosphere. That expectation is exactly what makes the eruption so remarkable. Geological evidence demonstrates that the basaltic fissure generated an eruption column, displaying the characteristics of a Plinian event. Instead of a single volcanic cone, the material erupted along a long fracture stretching across the mountain. The resulting column climbed to an estimated height between 17 and 28 miles, depending upon the phase of the eruption examined and the scientific model applied. Such behavior remains exceptionally uncommon within the geological record. The pattern of ash and scoria scattered across the surrounding countryside, reinforces that conclusion. Researchers comparing the deposits found that their distribution resembles the widespread pumice fall produced by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79. That ancient catastrophe buried Pompeii and Herculaneum beneath volcanic material generated by silica-rich magma. Tarawera achieved a comparable dispersal pattern through basalt, an outcome that continues to attract careful scientific investigation because the underlying physical processes remain unusually complex. Estimates suggest the eruption expelled as much as half a cubic mile of fragmented rock, ash, and volcanic debris. That amount is difficult to picture, yet it represents enough material to bury a mid-sized American city beneath hundreds of feet of fresh volcanic deposits. Every fragment preserved another clue to the unusual sequence of events that unfolded during those 6 hours. For volcanologists, Tarawera has become more than a historical disaster. It serves as one of the world's most important reference examples for understanding the rare circumstance in which a basaltic fissure eruption generates a Plinian-style eruption column. Each study adds another piece to an event that still resists complete explanation. The mountain that erased the celebrated terraces did so through a combination of volcanic processes that geology rarely witnesses, leaving behind one of the most extraordinary natural records ever examined. Among all those whose lives became intertwined with the eruption, one person stands at the center from beginning to end. Sophia Hinerangi was already known throughout New Zealand long before the mountain awakened. For more than 16 years, she had guided travelers across the lakes and along the warm terraces, introducing visitors from every corner of the world to a landscape she understood through both experience and ancestry. Fluent in several languages and respected by guests and local communities alike, she had become as recognizable as the destination itself. The days before the eruption placed her at every crucial turning point. She noticed unusual movement in the waters of Lake Tarawera during the excursion that preceded the disaster. She witnessed the strange canoe crossing the lake through the morning haze. She listened when the guides called out without receiving any reply. Believing the sight carried meaning beyond ordinary explanation, she sought the counsel of Tūhoto Ariki and heard his warning that a great calamity was approaching. Like everyone else, she then returned to the rhythm of daily life while the mountain continued changing beneath the ground. When the stronger earthquakes arrived during the early hours of June 10th, Sophia acted without hesitation. Instead of fleeing into darkness filled with falling ash and flying rock, she opened the doors of her ware and urged everyone nearby to gather inside. The house had been built with strength and care, using heavy timber that could better resist the growing weight accumulating overhead. Families, visitors, neighbors, and children crowded together until more than 60 people filled the single shelter, waiting while the earth trembled around them. Outside, roofs collapsed beneath saturated volcanic debris, and entire buildings failed within minutes. Inside the ware, the walls strained under the burden pressing from above, yet they continued standing. The people gathered there endured hours marked by violent shaking, deafening explosions, and complete darkness, relying upon the judgment of the woman who had chosen that shelter. When daylight finally returned, most of those protected within her home were still alive. The world awaiting them scarcely resembled the one they had entered only hours earlier. Familiar pathways had vanished beneath thick volcanic deposits. Forests had been flattened or stripped bare. Lake shores had shifted, and landmarks that once guided every journey had disappeared beneath ash or newly formed water. Sophia led survivors toward Rotorua by drawing upon memory more than sight, reconstructing routes that existed only in her mind while the altered landscape gradually revealed itself around them. Recognition came with painful certainty. The terraces she had shown to thousands of travelers were gone. Lake Rotomahana had expanded beyond its former boundaries, swallowing the places where visitors once rested beside warm pools. The flourishing destination that had supported neighboring communities had ended in a single night, leaving behind a transformed volcanic basin. Sophia remained a guide for the rest of her life. Visitors still sought her knowledge, though the journeys had changed completely. Instead of leading people toward the celebrated terraces, she guided them through the excavated remains of Tarawera, later known as the Buried Village. Each walk became a passage across memory as much as ground. When she died in 1911, she left behind more than stories of survival. She had preserved the living connection between the vanished wonder, the catastrophe that erased it, and the generations determined to remember both. 4 days after the eruption, the work of searching continued across a landscape that no longer resembled the settlements marked on maps. Rescue parties from Rotorua moved from one shattered building to another, cutting through hardened volcanic deposits and collapsed timber. Entire homes had disappeared beneath thick layers of ash. In many places, there was little expectation of finding anyone alive. The effort had become one of recovery as much as rescue, carried forward with patience because certainty was impossible beneath so much debris. While clearing the remains of one dwelling in Te Wairoa, the rescuers paused. From somewhere below the broken roof and compacted ash came a faint human sound. The workers listened again, then began digging with renewed determination. Every piece of timber removed opened another narrow space. Every layer of ash revealed another fragment of the room that had vanished beneath the eruption. At the center of the collapse, they reached a survivor whose continued existence seemed almost beyond belief. It was Tūhoto Ariki, the elderly Tohunga who had interpreted the appearance of the phantom canoe only days before the mountain erupted. Contemporary estimates placed his age somewhere between 100 and 110 years. He had remained beneath the ruins of his home from the morning of the eruption until the 14th of June, surviving without ordinary access to food and with only whatever moisture the surrounding ash and damaged structure could provide. His endurance immediately became one of the most extraordinary survival accounts associated with the disaster. Those who witnessed his rescue described a man who remained aware of his surroundings despite the ordeal. He recognized the people who reached him and responded coherently as they freed him from the confined space. Reports preserved from the aftermath consistently note that his first thoughts were directed outward. Before dwelling upon his own condition, he asked about the fate of his people, the villages, and those who might still be alive. Even after days beneath the ruins, his concern rested with the community whose future he had tried to protect. Among the Tūhoto people, the meaning of his survival reached beyond physical endurance alone. Many believed the same spiritual insight that had enabled him to recognize the warning carried by the phantom canoe had also sustained him through the days beneath the wreckage. To those who shared that belief, his rescue completed a sequence that had begun with the strange sight upon Lake Tarawera. The prophecy, the eruption, and the survival belonged to the same story, each giving meaning to the others. Others viewed the event through a different lens, emphasizing resilience, chance, and the remarkable strength of an elderly man who endured conditions that few people of any age could have survived. The historical record preserves both perspectives without forcing either to stand alone. Together, they reveal how communities sought understanding after an event that had overturned both the landscape and ordinary expectations. Tūhoto Ariki lived only a few weeks after his rescue. The hardship endured beneath the collapsed house left him too weakened to recover fully. His passing nevertheless carried a distinct place within the memory of the eruption. He had survived long enough to witness the fulfillment of the warning he believed the natural world had delivered. His account remains one of the defining human stories of Tarawera, remembered as much for the 11 days preceding the eruption as for the catastrophe itself. Across the oceans, the eruption traveled first as fragments of telegraph messages, then as detailed reports carried through newspapers and illustrated journals. Readers who had never seen Lake Rotomahana learned that an entire landscape had disappeared in a single night. Accounts described the eruption itself, the villages overwhelmed by ash, and the lives that had been lost. Alongside those human tragedies appeared another subject that newspapers returned to again and again: the destruction of the Pink and White Terraces. Editors treated the disappearance of the terraces with language usually reserved for the loss of great monuments. Articles compared their destruction to the fall of a celebrated cathedral or the disappearance of an artistic masterpiece whose value could never be recreated. Such comparisons reflected how widely known the formations had become during the Victorian era. Travelers crossing the British Empire often regarded a journey to the terraces as an essential destination, and guidebooks consistently ranked them among the world's most extraordinary natural wonders. For more than 4 decades, visitors had endured long journeys by ship, horseback, and foot to reach the steaming pools beside Lake Rotomahana. They returned home carrying sketches, paintings, photographs, and written descriptions that spread the reputation of the terraces even farther. By the time news of the eruption reached Europe, Australia, and the United States, countless readers already recognized the place through those earlier accounts. They understood immediately that something unique had vanished from the earth. Modern volcanologist Cornel Durand later offered a comparison that helps place the loss into present perspective. Imagine waking to discover that the Grand Canyon had disappeared overnight. The comparison is imperfect because every natural wonder possesses its own character, yet it conveys the extraordinary scale of what New Zealand lost. The terraces had no equal in size, complexity, or beauty among active silica formations. Their destruction represented more than local change. It altered the natural heritage of the entire planet. Artists who had known the terraces responded with particular urgency. Charles Blomfield, whose paintings had become some of the finest visual records of the site, returned after the catastrophe to preserve its memory. Although he had not witnessed the eruption himself, he carefully gathered eyewitness testimony and transformed those accounts into paintings depicting the mountain in eruption and the vanished landscape before its destruction. His work became an enduring bridge between memory and history, allowing later generations to glimpse places that photography alone had never fully captured. The surviving photographs also assumed a new significance. Albumin prints, created during the early 1880s, ceased to be ordinary travel souvenirs. Each image became evidence that the terraces had once existed exactly as described. Their value shifted from illustration to historical record, preserving details that no visitor would ever again observe with their own eyes. Within the Tūhoto community, remembrance followed a different path. Grief extended beyond the disappearance of a celebrated attraction. The terraces were treasured places woven into ancestral identity, spiritual tradition, and daily life. Many recalled Tūhoto Ariki's warning that sacred places opened without proper respect would eventually be reclaimed. Whether interpreted through faith, history, or geology, the eruption marked the end of a world that could never return. The mourning that followed honored both the people who had perished and the irreplaceable landscape that had shaped their lives for generations. When the ash settled and the shattered ground cooled enough for people to cross it again, the landscape offered an unexpected truth. The eruption had erased valleys, lake shores, and celebrated landmarks, yet it had also begun constructing an entirely different world. Fresh fractures, heated groundwater, and newly opened pathways beneath the surface continued shaping the land long after the eruption itself had ended. The transformation did not conclude with destruction. It entered another chapter of creation. The Waimangu Volcanic Rift Valley stretches for about 11 miles across the scar left by the eruption. Before the morning of June 10th, 1886, no such valley existed. Every steaming basin, mineral pool, fumarole, and hot spring within it either formed during those 6 hours or emerged in the years that followed as groundwater discovered new routes through fractured volcanic rock. It remains the youngest geothermal landscape on Earth, whose birth has been observed, documented, and tied to a precisely known historical eruption. Its Maori name, Waimangu, means black water. Early visitors chose that name after seeing streams stained by volcanic minerals and dark sediments washed from freshly broken slopes. Even after the violence had passed, the valley never became static. Heat continued rising from deep below, feeding springs whose chemistry shifted over time as water encountered different layers of rock. Every season revealed subtle changes, reminding observers that the eruption had rearranged an active geothermal system rather than leaving behind a finished landscape. Among the valley's earliest creations stood an astonishing new geyser. Within only a few years, the Waimangu geyser began erupting with a force unmatched anywhere else on the planet. Roughly every 30 to 36 hours, pressure accumulated beneath the surface until an immense column of water, steam, mud, and rock burst skyward. Some eruptions climbed nearly 1,500 feet above the ground. Witnesses described towering jets that remained visible across the valley before collapsing into clouds of spray and drifting mineral debris. This extraordinary display continued for about 18 years. Then, during 1904, a landslide altered the underground plumbing that supplied the geyser. Water could no longer circulate through the same passageways. The eruption stopped completely and never resumed. The largest geyser ever documented had existed for less than a generation, another reminder that geothermal landscapes can change within a human lifetime as readily as they evolve across thousands of years. Where that immense geyser once performed, Frying Pan Lake gradually became established. Today, it forms the largest active hot spring on Earth. Warm, mineral-rich water spreads across an immense basin, its surface averaging about 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam rises without interruption as dissolved gases escape into the air. Within those heated waters live specialized microscopic organisms adapted to conditions that would quickly overwhelm most forms of life, revealing how volcanic environments can become refuges for biological resilience. Nearby, Inferno Crater Lake follows its own measured rhythm. Its vivid blue water rises and falls through a cycle lasting about 38 days, responding to pressure changes within the geothermal network below. Scientists observe these fluctuations because they reveal how heat and water continue moving beneath the valley. The same subterranean energy that spent 7,000 years constructing the Pink and White Terraces destroyed them in a single morning, then immediately began shaping another landscape whose story is still unfolding beneath the Earth's surface. Ash can preserve as completely as it destroys. Across many parts of the world, volcanic deposits have sealed moments that would otherwise have disappeared into weather and memory. After the eruption of June 10th, 1886, Tarawera became one of those rare places where catastrophe halted ordinary life so abruptly that traces of it remained waiting beneath the ground. Within days, the surviving residents accepted that the village could not be reclaimed. Roofs had collapsed beneath the immense weight of wet volcanic debris. Roads had vanished beneath layers of ash. Fields that had supported daily life no longer resembled farmland. The familiar arrangement of homes, shops, gardens, and pathways had dissolved into an uneven gray surface. Those who escaped carried their memories elsewhere, leaving the settlement untouched by rebuilding. Nature covered what the eruption had already concealed. Beneath that blanket rested a complete community. The hotel where travelers had gathered after visiting the terraces remained where it had fallen. The flour mill, schoolhouse, general stores, and Maori meeting places stayed fixed beneath the deposits that had buried them. Everyday belongings remained where people had last placed them. Cups, tools, clothing, cooking vessels, furniture, and children's possessions all became part of a landscape preserved instead of scattered. Time continued beyond the village, while the village itself remained suspended beneath volcanic earth. Nearly 60 years passed before systematic excavation began. During the 1940s, the Smith family purchased the property and started uncovering what lay below. As layers of compacted ash were carefully removed, walls emerged, followed by doorways, foundations, and household objects that had remained protected from wind and rain for decades. Each discovery restored another fragment of a community interrupted within a single night. Archaeology revealed daily routines far more effectively than written descriptions alone ever could. One structure carried an especially remarkable history. Hinamihi, the Maori meeting house at Tarawera, survived the eruption even as destruction surrounded it. During the disaster, dozens of people found refuge beneath its roof and lived through the night. Several years later, in 1891, the Governor General arranged for its purchase and transport to England. Reassembled on the grounds of Clarendon Park in Surrey, it stood thousands of miles from the volcanic valley where it had first welcomed families and visitors. Its journey did not end there. Although separated from its homeland, Hinamihi continued serving the purpose for which it had been built. Maori communities living in England gathered within the meeting house for ceremonies, remembrance, and cultural events, giving the building an unbroken human connection that stretched across continents and generations. Wood carved in the North Island continued carrying familiar voices despite standing within an English landscape. Today, the buried village remains an active archaeological site rather than a finished excavation. Researchers continue uncovering buildings, pathways, coins, domestic objects, and personal possessions from the volcanic layers. Each season adds another piece to the story of the settlement that welcomed travelers before the eruption. The world that flourished on the eve of June 10th, 1886, has not vanished completely. Much of it still rests beneath the ash, emerging little by little as careful hands uncover the ground where ordinary life paused and endured. Some landscapes recover through rebuilding. Others are allowed to remain untouched. After the eruption had transformed Mount Tarawera and the communities around it, the response of the local Maori people reached beyond practical decisions about settlement or travel. The mountain itself entered a different relationship with those who had always known it. It became a place set apart, carrying obligations that could not be measured by maps or ownership alone. In the months following the disaster, Mount Tarawera was placed under a formal tapu, a sacred prohibition recognized by the iwi, whose history was inseparable from the mountain. The slopes held the resting places of those who had died, along with memories too deeply connected to the eruption to permit ordinary passage. Entering that ground without proper purpose would have violated both spiritual law and communal responsibility. The restriction carried genuine authority because it reflected values shared across generations rather than a temporary response to grief. For 100 years, from 1886 until 1986, the prohibition remained in effect. Visitors did not wander across the summit. Researchers did not establish permanent study sites. Recreational travel never developed along the fractured ridgeline. The mountains stood apart from the expanding network of roads, farms, and tourist destinations that gradually reshaped other parts of the North Island. Its scars weathered beneath rain, sunlight, and seasonal growth, largely without direct human alteration. This long period of protection produced an unexpected consequence. No one established the tapu to benefit future geological research. Its purpose was cultural and spiritual, rooted in respect for the dead and for the transformed landscape itself. Even so, the absence of frequent human activity preserved details that might otherwise have disappeared beneath construction, excavation, or careless collecting. Many volcanic sites around the world experienced extensive disturbance within years of their eruptions. Tarawera followed a different path. Scientific investigation often requires excavation, measurement, and sampling, yet those same activities can erase delicate evidence. Footpaths alter fragile deposits. Loose rocks are removed from their original positions. Small landforms gradually lose their defining shapes after decades of repeated visitation. At Tarawera, those ordinary processes occurred far more gradually because access remained restricted. The mountain continued changing through natural weathering, although its essential eruption features endured with unusual clarity. When the tapu was formally lifted in 1986, access returned through arrangements developed cooperatively by the Maori landowners and organizations responsible for guided visits and environmental stewardship. Researchers reaching the summit encountered a volcanic landscape that still displayed the principal features created during the eruption. The long fissure remained sharply expressed across the ridgeline. Rift craters retained their form. Dark basalt from the eruption still marked broad stretches of the surface, allowing scientists to examine relationships that had survived a full century. Those observations strengthened understanding of how the eruption unfolded from one end of the mountain to the other. The preserved landforms helped clarify the sequence of fracturing, magma movement, and crater formation with a level of confidence rarely possible after such a long interval. The century shaped by tapu became more than a pause between disaster and investigation. Respect for a sacred landscape also safeguarded an exceptional geological record, allowing cultural tradition and scientific discovery to meet upon the same enduring ground. Some discoveries begin with excavation, others begin with a forgotten shelf. For more than a century after the eruption, the fate of the Pink and White Terraces seemed settled in both science and public memory. The explosions had shattered the geothermal basin, the lake had spread across a transformed landscape, and the famous formations had passed into history. That conclusion rested upon reasonable evidence, yet one essential detail remained uncertain. No one could identify the exact place where the terraces had stood before the earth changed shape. The difficulty grew from the scale of the eruption itself. Lake Rotomahana no longer resembled the modest body of water that travelers had crossed during the 19th century. Its shoreline had expanded dramatically, familiar landmarks had disappeared, and new crater walls enclosed water where dry ground had once existed. Earlier maps could no longer be aligned with confidence. Even experienced geologists struggled to translate the landscape, described by eyewitnesses, into the geography visible after 1886. Long before the disaster, however, one visitor had approached the lake with scientific precision. In 1859, a young Austrian geologist named Ferdinand von Hochstetter arrived in New Zealand during the voyage of the scientific expedition aboard the vessel named the Ship of His Majesty Novara. At only 29 years of age, he spent valuable days examining Lake Rotomahana, measuring elevations, recording compass bearings, sketching shorelines, and documenting the positions of prominent geothermal features. His observations created the most complete scientific survey of the lake before the eruption. After completing his work, von Hochstetter returned to Europe and continued publishing studies of New Zealand geology. He died in 1884, never knowing that the landscape he had measured with such care would vanish only 2 years later. As decades passed, researchers relied upon his published work whenever they studied the region, although they believed the original field notes had disappeared. Without those first-hand measurements, the published material lacked the precision needed to reconstruct the exact positions of the terraces. The missing record had never entered a public archive. Instead, the handwritten diary remained within the Hochstetter family, preserved among personal possessions and largely unknown outside their household. Generations passed before its existence reached the scientific community. In 2010, descendants of the geologist revealed that the diary had rested for 151 years in their private library in Switzerland. They agreed to make the manuscript available for careful study. Its pages contained far more than personal reflections. Compass bearings stretched across the margins. Sketches captured the shape of the shoreline before the eruption. Elevation notes connected landmarks with remarkable care. Together, they formed the navigational framework that researchers had lacked for more than a century. Modern surveying techniques could finally be linked with observations recorded beside the original lake. Scientists compared the 19th century bearings with contemporary satellite positioning and detailed surveys of the enlarged lake basin. Working backward through geometry and preserved reference points, they calculated where the vanished shoreline must once have existed. The analysis converged upon a specific location beneath the modern waters. In February 2011, a research team arrived at Lake Rotomahana carrying sophisticated robotic underwater vehicles, guided toward the lake floor by directions written 152 years earlier inside a handwritten diary that had waited patiently in a family library in Switzerland. Across the broad surface of Lake Rotomahana, nothing hinted that an answer might still rest below the water. More than 125 years had passed since the eruption, and the expanded lake had become an accepted part of the landscape. Beneath it, researchers hoped to understand a submerged geothermal system still changing after the catastrophe. Recovering any trace of the Pink and White Terraces remained a distant possibility, included in the expedition with cautious optimism rather than confidence. The international research team combined expertise from New Zealand and the United States. It was led by Cornel Durand of the Institute of Geological and Nuclear Sciences, working alongside scientists from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the University of Waikato. Their principal objective centered upon mapping the lake floor and examining the remarkable hydrothermal landscape that had continued evolving beneath the water since the eruption transformed the basin. To accomplish that work, the expedition relied upon two autonomous underwater vehicles known as Remote Environmental Measuring Units, 100. Each resembled a streamlined torpedo built for detailed exploration beneath lakes and coastal waters. They carried side-scan sonar, precise depth mapping instruments, and navigation systems capable of tracing the lake floor with extraordinary accuracy. Every pass added another narrow strip to a growing picture of terrain that no human eye had seen directly. The search area itself came from calculations rooted in Ferdinand von Hochstetter's field diary. His compass bearings from 1859 had been reconstructed against the altered shoreline and the modern shape of Lake Rotomahana. If the mathematics were correct, the lower portion of the Pink Terrace should lie beneath roughly 200 feet of water. Even so, many researchers expected to encounter little beyond scattered fragments or an uneven field of volcanic debris. As the underwater vehicles crossed the target area, the sonar began returning patterns, unlike the surrounding lake floor. Instead of random piles of rock, the instruments revealed broad crescent formations arranged in successive steps. The geometry stood apart from ordinary volcanic deposits. Curving ledges descended, one after another, with the graceful repetition expected from silica terraces formed by mineral-rich hot springs over thousands of years. Thick layers of brown lake sediment softened their appearance, yet the underlying structure remained distinct. Cameras carried by the expedition provided another piece of evidence. Along the edges where sediment had thinned, portions of the stepped formations emerged into view. Their outlines matched the sonar data with remarkable consistency. Cornel Durand later stated that he was about 95% certain the expedition had identified the lower reaches of the Pink Terrace. Reflecting upon the discovery, he remarked that highlights in a scientific career do not become better than that moment. The announcement reached the public on February 3, 2011. For 125 years, the prevailing belief had held that the eighth wonder of the world had vanished completely during the eruption. The underwater survey offered a different conclusion. Much of the celebrated formation had escaped total destruction. It had endured beneath the enlarged lake, concealed by water and sediment, waiting until 19th century observations and 21st century technology met upon the same patch of lake floor. A discovery rarely ends a scientific story. More often, it replaces one certainty with a smaller collection of better questions. The surveys beneath Lake Rotomahana had demonstrated that the long-accepted belief in complete destruction was incomplete. Parts of the Pink Terrace appeared to have survived beneath water and volcanic sediment. At the same time, the evidence revealed how much of the landscape still resisted confident interpretation. The strongest results centered upon the Pink Terrace. Sonar imagery, underwater photographs, and comparisons with the reconstructed 19th century shoreline all converged on the same conclusion. The submerged formations matched the expected position and distinctive curved architecture of silica terraces. Multiple lines of evidence pointed toward the same location, giving researchers a high level of confidence that they had identified genuine remnants of one of the most celebrated geothermal formations ever known. The White Terrace presented a more difficult puzzle. Before the eruption, it had occupied a different part of the lake basin, closer to the area where the most violent phreatomagmatic explosions reshaped the ground. Seismic investigations of its probable location produced a far less consistent picture. Instead of clearly recognizable terrace geometry, the instruments detected a landscape that appeared more thoroughly disrupted. One possible explanation suggested that the White Terrace had absorbed a greater share of the explosive forces that accompanied the expanding crater system, leaving fewer recognizable structures behind. Researchers returned in 2012 with improved technology capable of producing a far more detailed portrait of the lake floor. Multi-beam sonar mapped submerged terrain with a resolution finer than 3 feet, revealing steep crater walls, collapse scars, eruption vents, and the rugged topography created during the 6 hours that transformed the basin. Beneath layers of sediment, seismic instruments capable of looking below the lake floor detected a series of stacked reflective horizons within the target area. Those layered reflections matched what scientists would expect from successive silica deposits arranged one above another. The accumulating evidence suggested that portions of the Pink Terrace remained buried beneath approximately 6 feet of volcanic mud. Subsequent expeditions strengthened that interpretation. Remotely operated underwater vehicles photographed terrace edges emerging from the sediment, providing direct visual records of stepped formations resting upon the lake floor. Although much remained concealed, the photographs aligned closely with the shapes identified earlier through sonar mapping and seismic surveys. Scientific understanding continued to improve as additional records and survey data were brought together. In 2025, Earth Sciences New Zealand, created through the merger of the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research and the Institute of Geological and Nuclear Sciences, confirmed the former position of the terraces by combining Ferdinand von Hochstetter's diary with every major modern survey completed across the lake. The resulting reconstruction represented the most precise location estimate achieved since the search began. Even now, important uncertainties remain. Researchers still cannot determine how much of the surviving silica architecture remains structurally complete beneath the sediment. The true condition of the White Terrace continues to resist firm conclusions. The total extent of submerged formations has yet to be fully measured. Another question reaches beyond geology. Even if additional remnants could someday be uncovered, deciding whether they should ever be disturbed belongs not only to science, but also to history, culture, memory, and the people whose connection to this landscape extends far beyond the eruption itself. Some places preserve more than geology. Their layers hold memory, ancestry, and events that cannot be separated from the ground itself. Lake Rotomahana belongs to that kind of landscape. The discoveries beneath its surface transformed scientific understanding of the Pink Terrace, yet they also brought researchers to a realization that had always existed for the people whose history is rooted there. The lake is not merely the setting of a remarkable geological event, it is also a resting place for those who never left it. When the phreatomagmatic explosions tore through the basin on June 10, 1886, nearby communities lay directly within the path of the expanding devastation. Pyroclastic surges swept across villages surrounding the lake before heavy ash completed the destruction. Homes collapsed, settlements disappeared, and many of those who died became part of the same deposits that settled across the transformed landscape. The volcanic mud covering the submerged terraces also covers the remains of villages and the people who lived within them. For the Tūhoto and Ngāti Rangitihi tribal communities, this understanding has never been symbolic or abstract. Lake Rotomahana is regarded as a burial ground because ancestors rest within it. Their presence gives the water a significance extending beyond archaeology or volcanology. Every proposal involving the lake floor must therefore recognize responsibilities that existed long before modern scientific expeditions arrived with sonar equipment and underwater vehicles. That relationship is reflected in New Zealand's legal framework as well as its cultural traditions. Through the principles established under the Treaty of Waitangi, the tribal authorities hold recognized rights connected to the lake and its surrounding lands. Any excavation, recovery effort, or physical disturbance requires their agreement and proceeds only under arrangements that respect their authority. Decisions concerning the submerged terraces cannot be made through scientific interest alone, regardless of how valuable additional discoveries might appear. The researchers involved in the underwater investigations acknowledged this responsibility openly. Amy Kukulia of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution explained during the expedition that the lake was, in reality, a burial ground. She recalled conversations with local people whose own ancestors had been lost during the eruption, reminding listeners that every survey crossed a place of continuing family connection rather than an abandoned historical site. Those words established an important boundary around the scientific achievements of the expedition. The collaborative structure of the continuing investigation reflects that same principle. The Terraces Research Group includes the Tuawangi Tribal Authority as a central partner in decisions concerning future work. Their participation reaches beyond consultation or ceremonial recognition. They possess the authority to guide, approve, refuse, or reshape proposed activities affecting the lake. Scientific expertise and cultural stewardship stand beside one another throughout the process. That partnership has changed the character of the search itself. The question is no longer limited to whether additional sections of the terraces can be located or documented beneath the sediment. Another consideration now accompanies every technical possibility. Would recovering more of the formation justify disturbing a place where ancestors remain at rest, or does preservation carry the greater responsibility? Geology can describe what lies beneath the water. Engineering can explain how it might be reached. The final decision belongs elsewhere. As of this recording, that decision has not been made, and the lake continues to hold both its remarkable geological history and its human history together beneath the same surface. Attention often settles upon the submerged terraces. Yet another transformation has been unfolding nearby ever since the eruption reshaped Lake Rotomahana. Far below the surface, water continues to circulate through fractured volcanic rock, carrying heat from deep within the earth. That movement has never ceased. It has merely taken place beneath a lake that did not exist before June 10th, 1886, creating one of the most unusual natural laboratories known to modern geology. This hidden system formed the primary objective of the major underwater investigations begun more than a century after the eruption. The search for the terraces captured public imagination, although the scientific expedition was designed first to understand the geothermal network itself. Researchers recognized that the eruption had done something almost without parallel. It had submerged an active hydrothermal landscape whose earlier condition was already documented before catastrophe transformed it. Few places on Earth preserve such a complete sequence from life above the surface to continued activity below it. Before the eruption, heated water reached daylight through springs, pools, and silica formations surrounding the original shoreline. When the explosion enlarged the basin and the lake expanded to many times its former extent, those pathways disappeared beneath deep water. Heat, however, continued rising from the same volcanic engine. The circulation of mineral-rich fluids adapted to new pressure conditions, opening fresh routes through fractured rock, while older channels became sealed beneath volcanic deposits. For geoscientist Cornel Durand, this made Lake Rotomahana important for reasons extending beyond the search for a celebrated geological wonder. Much of his career has focused on hydrothermal vents across the Pacific Ocean, where heated water escapes through the deep sea floor. Beneath Lake Rotomahana, he recognized a related process unfolding within an inland setting. The comparison offered scientists an opportunity unavailable in the open ocean because the landscape before submergence had been mapped, described, and witnessed by people whose observations survived into the present. Each survey has shown that the underwater system remains active. Heated fluids continue carrying dissolved minerals upward before they cool and settle across the lake floor. Thin mineral coatings accumulate upon existing surfaces. New hydrothermal structures gradually emerge, while older deposits become enclosed beneath successive layers. Every passing year adds another page to a geological record that continues writing itself without interruption. That continuing growth creates an unusual scientific balance. The same natural processes preserving evidence in one location may conceal it in another. Mineral deposits can shield fragile formations from erosion while also covering details that once lay exposed. Sediment carried through the lake adds another layer across the landscape, leaving researchers to distinguish between the world that existed before the eruption and the one still developing today. Viewed across human lifetimes, those changes appear almost motionless. Measured through careful observation, they reveal constant motion operating beneath the water. The drowned geothermal system has never become a fossil of the past. It remains alive, reshaping its surroundings through the same internal energy that once fed the Pink and White Terraces. Scientists therefore study more than a vanished landscape. They observe an evolving one, where the record of 1886 and the geology of the present continue meeting upon the same lake floor, each layer preserving part of the story while gradually transforming the one beneath it. The mountain has settled into another long interval, though its story has never reached an ending. The ridges formed during the eruption remain exposed beneath changing seasons, while deep below them, heat continues moving through fractured rock and molten reservoirs. Mount Tarawera belongs to a volcanic landscape that is still active, its history measured in pauses between eruptions rather than in permanent endings. The most recent eruptive activity within the wider Rotomahana area was recorded in 1951, a reminder that the forces shaping this region remain present. Today, the volcano is observed with instruments that never existed during the 19th century. Networks of seismometers register tremors too small for human senses. Ground deformation is measured through satellite positioning systems capable of detecting movements measured in fractions of an inch across broad areas. Gas released through geothermal fields is sampled and compared through time, allowing researchers to recognize shifts that may reflect changing conditions below the surface. Streams of information arrive every day, forming a continuous record that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. These observations are coordinated by Earth Sciences New Zealand, the organization responsible for monitoring volcanic activity across the country. Scientists compare earthquake patterns, changes in ground elevation, geothermal behavior, and gas chemistry, searching for combinations that resemble the earliest stages of volcanic unrest. Any single observation may have an ordinary explanation. Multiple changes appearing together deserve much closer attention because volcanoes often communicate through several signals before magma approaches the surface. The deeper source of that activity extends beyond Mount Tarawera itself. The volcano forms part of the Okataina Volcanic Center, one element within the larger Taupo volcanic zone. Magma circulates through this extensive volcanic province where separate volcanic systems share a common tectonic environment. Farther south lies Lake Taupo, whose Hatepe eruption around the year 232 remains among the most powerful eruptions of the recent geological past. Pyroclastic flows spread across approximately 7,700 square miles, while ash entered the upper atmosphere in quantities great enough to influence climate far beyond New Zealand. Another eruption, comparable to 1886, would unfold within a landscape transformed by modern settlement. Rotorua, home to more than 70,000 residents, stands roughly 15 miles from the summit. Neighborhoods occupy ground where geothermal heat reaches close to the surface. Roads, schools, hospitals, communications networks, and public utilities now cover terrain that was far less developed when the mountain last erupted. Volcanic ash would spread across broad portions of the North Island. Drinking water supplies could become contaminated by fine particles. Heavy accumulations upon rooftops would increase the danger of structural failure during rainfall. Farms could lose crops and grazing land beneath abrasive ash, while transportation would face widespread disruption as airports, highways, and rail corridors struggled to remain operational. The consequences would extend far beyond communities nearest the volcano. Researchers believe that renewed unrest before an eruption might provide warning measured in hours or days. The eruption of 1886 was preceded by earthquakes, changes around geothermal features, and rising water levels within the lake. People witnessed those events without recognizing their connection because no established science yet explained their meaning. Modern monitoring can identify similar patterns with far greater confidence. Even so, recognizing warning signs and possessing enough time to protect every community remain separate challenges, leaving the mountain as both a carefully studied neighbor and an active participant in the living geology of the present. Many landscapes possess an extraordinary ability to return after devastation. Forests reclaim burned hillsides. Coral colonies gradually spread across damaged reefs. Rivers carve fresh channels through abandoned valleys. Given enough time, familiar shapes often emerge once more, altered yet recognizable. The earth has immense patience, and many of its creations are renewed through the same processes that first brought them into being. The Pink and White Terraces belong to a different category of natural formation. Their disappearance cannot be understood as the temporary interruption of an ordinary cycle. They were the outcome of a sequence so specific that geology offers no comparable example at the same scale. Their loss was not merely the destruction of a beautiful place. It marked the end of a process that had unfolded under conditions unlikely to gather together again. Several requirements had to remain in balance across thousands of years. A magma body rested at the proper depth to warm underground water without disrupting the system through constant eruption. That circulating water carried precisely the concentration of dissolved silica needed for steady mineral deposition. The surrounding hillside provided a natural staircase over which the mineral-rich water could flow, cool, and leave behind successive layers. None of these ingredients alone could have produced the terraces. Their existence depended upon every condition remaining stable through countless generations. Each passing season added only a thin film of fresh silica. Layer rested upon layer, with almost unimaginable patience. Minute deposits gradually widened pools, strengthened rims, and extended graceful shelves farther down the slope. Rainfall, groundwater circulation, volcanic heat, and mineral chemistry remained balanced long enough for thousands of years of uninterrupted construction. Human history advanced through kingdoms, migrations, discoveries, and empires, while the terraces continued growing at their own measured pace. Silica terraces exist elsewhere in the world. Yellowstone contains beautiful examples shaped by geothermal springs. Pamukkale in Turkey displays brilliant white mineral cascades that have inspired travelers for centuries. These formations demonstrate that the underlying geological process is real and continues today. None combines the immense scale, intricate architecture, great age, and documented historical significance of the Pink and White Terraces at Lake Rotomahana. Even if an identical hydrothermal system began operating today at precisely the same location, the result would remain far beyond any human horizon. The slow accumulation of silica cannot be hurried. No engineering method can persuade dissolved minerals to condense thousands of years ahead of their natural rhythm. Geological time obeys no calendar created by civilization. A formation requiring approximately 7,000 years of uninterrupted growth cannot be replaced within a lifetime, a century, or even many civilizations. Independent researcher Professor Ron Keim examined the development of the hydrothermal system in 2016, concluding that an age of roughly 7,000 years represented a conservative estimate. Some calculations suggested the geothermal activity responsible for the terraces may have begun as early as about 5,000 years before the present era, extending their history even farther into the distant past. That perspective changes the meaning of what vanished during those 6 hours. The terraces were never a feature that could be reconstructed after loss. They represented a singular convergence of volcanic heat, groundwater chemistry, landscape, and immense spans of time. The eruption interrupted a creation that the planet had assembled only once in recorded memory. What remains beneath the lake preserves part of that achievement, yet the completed masterpiece belongs to a chapter of Earth's history that cannot begin again. Every vanished landscape leaves behind traces of itself, though no trace is ever complete. Some survive as measurements, others as sketches, photographs, journals, or memory carried from one generation to another. The Pink and White Terraces disappeared before color photography, motion pictures, or sound recording became commonplace. What remains is an unusually rich collection of human observation, assembled across 4 decades by travelers who believed they were recording a place that would always exist. Among those observers, Charles Blomfield occupies a singular place. He returned to the terraces more than once, spending over 6 weeks studying them during one extended visit. Working with patience and close attention, he produced large paintings that carefully documented the sweeping silica steps, the surrounding vegetation, and the changing relationship between water and light. After the eruption, those canvases became the principal visual reference for a world that no longer stood before any living artist. Blomfield approached his work with remarkable care, yet every painting remained an interpretation. A painter chooses where to stand, what to emphasize, and how the eye should travel across a scene. Color, distance, atmosphere, and proportion all pass through human judgment before reaching the canvas. His paintings preserve careful observation, though they also preserve the perspective of the individual who held the brush. They reveal both the terraces themselves and the manner in which one attentive witness understood them. Photography offered a different kind of testimony. Albumin prints produced during the 1880s recorded the contours of the formations with impressive precision. Terraced pools, scalloped rims, and broad silica slopes appear with a clarity that continues to assist modern researchers. Even so, the technology of the period imposed its own limitations. The photographs reduced the landscape to shades of light and shadow, leaving the famous colors beyond their reach. The pale blue water, the soft pink mineral surfaces, and the changing appearance created by seasonal light survive only in descriptions written by those who stood there. Words preserve qualities that cameras cannot. One visitor described the White Terrace as being grand enough to serve as the steps to heaven. The phrase conveys no measurable dimension and offers no geological detail, yet it communicates the scale of emotional experience inspired by the place. Scientific records explain composition and formation. Personal accounts reveal how human beings responded when confronted by something that seemed to exceed ordinary expectation. The Maori names preserve another layer of memory. Teterata, often translated as the tattooed rock, reflects physical character while carrying cultural meaning shaped long before European visitors arrived. Te Otukaporangi, the fountain of the clouded sky, joins landscape, language, and tradition within a single name. These names remain part of the surviving record, expressing relationships between people and place that cannot be measured through maps or photographs alone. Even when every surviving source is considered together, important parts of the experience remain beyond recovery. No image records the shifting warmth felt while standing beside the upper pools on a cool morning. No photograph preserves the changing sound of flowing mineral water or the scent carried upward with rising steam. Those details departed with the generations who witnessed them. What endures is a remarkable archive assembled through paint, paper, language, and memory, allowing later centuries to approach the terraces with growing understanding while accepting that some dimensions of the original place passed from the world forever. A discovery can answer one question while giving rise to another that has no clear endpoint. The submerged terraces now occupy that uncertain place. Their location has been narrowed with increasing confidence. Their surviving structure appears more substantial than many expected, and the tools capable of reaching them continue to improve. None of those developments has settled the central issue. They have made it more immediate. Across scientific institutions, Maori leadership, and heritage specialists, the discussion continues with careful attention and no universal agreement. One view begins with the terraces themselves. If substantial portions remain intact beneath the lake floor, they represent a geological archive unlike any other. Layer upon layer of silica accumulated over thousands of years as mineral-rich water flowed across the hillside. Each deposit reflects subtle changes in groundwater chemistry, volcanic heat, and hydrothermal circulation. Scientists believe those preserved layers could reveal how long-lived geothermal systems evolve, how mineral terraces develop, and how comparable hydrothermal environments may behave elsewhere across the Pacific Ocean. Information of that depth cannot be recreated in a laboratory after the original formation has been lost. Another perspective begins somewhere entirely different. The sediment covering the terraces is also the material that settled after the eruption buried nearby settlements and claimed many lives. Human remains, cultural sites, and geological deposits occupy the same landscape beneath the water. Separating one from the other is not practically possible. Any excavation intended to expose the terraces would disturb a place regarded by the Tūhoto and Ngati Rangitihi iwi as a burial ground holding their ancestors. Scientific value does not erase that responsibility, nor does archaeological curiosity stand above it. Between those positions, another approach has gradually gathered support. Continue learning without excavation. Improve underwater mapping, refine seismic imaging, expand photographic surveys, and compare every new observation with the historical record assembled over the past century and a half. Advances in remote sensing now reveal details that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Instruments can penetrate sediment, measure subtle differences in buried structures, and construct increasingly accurate three-dimensional models while leaving the lake floor untouched. This philosophy has already demonstrated its value. The location confirmed through the integration of Ferdinand von Hochstetter's field records with modern positioning data and sonar surveys relied upon observation rather than disturbance. The result strengthened scientific understanding while respecting the physical integrity of the site. Each improvement in imaging technology broadens that possibility, allowing knowledge to grow through patience instead of excavation. Conversation has occasionally turned toward a crude submersible capable of descending to the depth of the terraces. Such a journey would place human observers near formations that no living person has directly witnessed since the eruption of 1886. The idea remains only a proposal. No descent has taken place, and decisions concerning direct access continue to rest with the iwi, who hold authority over the lake. The discussion surrounding Lake Rotomahana reaches beyond one remarkable landscape. Similar questions arise wherever scientific evidence and places of burial occupy the same ground. Knowledge offers one kind of inheritance, memory offers another. Lasting stewardship asks whether both can remain honored together, even when complete certainty must wait. Some stories can be reduced to a pair of numbers. This one cannot be understood without them. Around 7,000 years of uninterrupted formation, about 6 hours of destruction. Those figures are not symbols created for dramatic effect. They describe the unequal rhythm by which the earth builds and erases. One process unfolds across countless generations. The other can pass before a single day has ended. The pink and white terraces accumulated through persistence beyond ordinary imagination. Mineral-rich water emerged from the ground, released dissolved silica, and left behind a thin deposit. Another layer followed, then another, each almost imperceptible on its own. Century after century, those deposits widened pools, strengthened rims, and extended graceful steps down the hillside. No craftsman directed the work. Gravity, heat, groundwater, and chemistry repeated the same patient act until repetition itself became architecture. People entered that story near its conclusion. Maori communities knew the terraces for many generations, weaving them into memory, travel, language, and identity. European visitors encountered them for only about 45 years before the eruption transformed the landscape forever. Those decades produced paintings, photographs, guidebooks, scientific observations, and countless written impressions. They occupy much of the historical record, yet they represent only a brief chapter within a creation that had already endured for thousands of years before anyone preserved it with ink or camera. The greater share of that history unfolded without human witnesses. Water continued its work through changing seasons, across centuries of storms, droughts, and earthquakes. Layer settled upon layer, whether anyone stood nearby or not. The terraces required no audience. Their beauty emerged from physical laws operating with complete consistency, indifferent to recognition, admiration, or fame. Human awareness arrived late, recorded what it could, and departed long before the geological process itself reached its end. The same indifference appears in the eruption that overwhelmed them. The volcanic forces beneath Lake Rotomahana did not distinguish between celebrated landscapes, villages, forests, or bare rock. Energy stored within the earth found its path to the surface, reshaped the land, and altered a system that had evolved across many millennia. Measured against geological time, 6 hours became enough to interrupt 7,000 years of uninterrupted construction. That imbalance offers a different way to understand natural history. Human calendars encourage short horizons. We remember lifetimes, nations, and civilizations. Geological processes measure duration by entirely different standards. Mountains rise, lakes migrate, rivers carve valleys, and mineral formations accumulate according to clocks that continue, regardless of whether anyone observes them. What appears permanent within a human lifetime may exist only briefly within the deeper history of the planet. Perhaps that is why the story of the terraces continues to resonate long after their disappearance from the surface. Their value was never defined by the number of visitors they welcomed or the years they remained famous. Those moments occupy only a narrow interval within a far longer existence. The terraces belonged first to the earth that formed them, then to the people who came to know them, and finally to history itself, where 7,000 years and 6 hours remain forever linked by a ratio that no human effort can reverse. At first glance, the history of the terraces appears to divide neatly into two chapters. One is creation, the other is destruction. Geology does not recognize that boundary. It tells a different story, one in which both chapters belong to the same process, unfolding across different spans of time. For thousands of years, heat rising from magma beneath Lake Rotomahana warmed groundwater circulating through fractured rock. That heated water dissolved silica, carried it upward, and released it at the surface. Layer settled upon layer until pools, rims, and broad white and pink stairways emerged from the hillside. The terraces were never separate from the volcanic system beneath them. Every shimmering basin and every polished step depended upon energy rising from deep within the earth. Remove that heat, and the terraces would never have existed. The eruption of June 10th, 1886, came from that very source. Magma forced its way upward through the crust, opening a long fissure across the landscape. When rising rock encountered groundwater, violent steam explosions reshaped the basin in a matter of hours. The hydrothermal system that had patiently supplied mineral-rich water for around 7,000 years became part of an eruption that transformed the entire region. The force that ended the terraces did not arrive from somewhere beyond their world. It had always been present beneath them, sustaining them from the beginning. That relationship is more than a poetic reflection. It is the geological reality. A volcanic system cannot promise only creation. The same reservoir of heat, capable of nourishing springs, geysers, and mineral terraces, also contains the potential to fracture the ground, redirect underground water, and alter every landscape built upon it. Stability and upheaval belong to the same engine. Time determines which face of that engine reaches the surface. The surrounding region offers other expressions of that shared origin. Waimangu Geyser, born after the eruption, became the largest geyser ever recorded. Its towering eruptions eventually ceased when ordinary geological change altered the underground plumbing that sustained it. Frying Pan Lake, another feature created through the events of 1886, continues to circulate heated water today. Mineral-rich fluids still rise through its depths, and its chemistry continues to evolve. Neither place stands apart from the story of the terraces. Each represents a different stage within the same geothermal system. The Rift Valley, the steaming ground, the crater lakes, and Mount Tarawera itself also belong to that continuing pattern. Some features disappear while others emerge. Water finds new pathways. Heat escapes through fresh openings. Minerals accumulate in one place while erosion removes them from another. The landscape does not reach a final state. It continues adjusting to forces operating far below the surface. From the perspective of a human lifetime, the terraces were built, admired, and lost. From the perspective of the volcanic system that produced them, The eruption marked only one moment within a process extending across millions of years. The Earth was not changing direction. It was continuing the same work by different means. Creation and destruction were never opposing acts. They were successive expressions of a single restless planet, forever reshaping itself through the very forces that first gave it form. The terraces once seemed as dependable as the hillside that carried them. Travelers crossed oceans, expecting to find them exactly where earlier visitors had stood. Guides led the same paths. Artists returned to familiar viewpoints. Local families lived beside a landscape that appeared as enduring as the horizon itself. Very few people imagined that an entire natural wonder could disappear between one sunrise and the next. The ground felt permanent because human lives are too brief to witness most geological change. The eruption overturned that assumption in a single morning. The earth revealed itself as something far less fixed than memory had suggested. Mountains rise, lakes expand, valleys fracture, and geothermal systems redirect themselves according to forces that pay no attention to human expectation. Stability is often the appearance created by watching a process that moves more slowly than a lifetime. The terraces had always belonged to a landscape in motion. Their long existence made that motion difficult to recognize until change arrived all at once. Other moments in this story carry the same lesson. A respected Maori elder spoke of signs that deserved attention, yet many listeners placed greater confidence in ordinary routine than unusual warning. Changes around the lake were observed, discussed, and then folded back into everyday experience because they did not fit existing expectations. The volcano had rested for 572 years, and that remarkable span encouraged the belief that the future would resemble the recent past. Each observation gained new meaning only after the eruption rearranged everything around it. The terraces themselves followed a similar path through human understanding. They became celebrated because painters, photographers, writers, and travelers carried their image beyond New Zealand. Their reputation expanded with every published description and every carefully packed photograph. Yet admiration alone did not fully reveal what had existed. Only after the formations disappeared did people begin to grasp that no comparable landscape stood elsewhere on Earth. Recognition deepened through absence. Loss became the measure by which uniqueness was finally understood. This pattern reaches far beyond one volcanic basin. Human attention often depends upon contrast. We notice what has changed, what has vanished, and what no longer accompanies ordinary life. Familiar places gradually become part of the background until some event interrupts their presence. The interruption sharpens perception. Looking backward becomes easier than looking carefully at what still remains before us. That tendency is neither unusual nor careless. Minds evolve to respond to immediate change. Landscapes unfolding across centuries rarely demand urgent notice. Geological time moves with extraordinary patience, while human attention is drawn toward the sudden, the unexpected, and the immediate. The difference between those rhythms shapes much of our relationship with the natural world. The story of Tarawera, therefore, leaves behind more than the memory of a vanished wonder. It offers a habit of observation. Every forest, shoreline, spring, reef, glacier, and mountain exists within a history far older than the people who encounter it. Their value does not begin when someone names them, paints them, or studies them. They possess that value already. Sometimes the most meaningful act available is to notice them while they are still becoming part of the living world around us, before memory becomes the only place where they can be found. Another evening settles over Lake Rotomahana, and the mountain remains under observation. Instruments stand where earlier generations had only memory and instinct. Seismometers register each faint movement within the Earth. Global positioning system stations measure changes in the ground so small they would escape every human sense. Sensors continue sampling gases released from nearby geothermal fields. None of these devices can prevent an eruption. They exist to listen, to compare each new signal with the long record that has grown since the volcano last transformed the landscape. Far below the lake, the terraces remain where research now places them. Layers of volcanic sediment rest across formations that may still preserve portions of their original shape. Water passes above them every hour of every day. The sonar images, seismic reflections, and photographs gathered through careful exploration have revealed outlines where certainty once seemed impossible. Those structures do not announce themselves. They rest within a landscape changed almost beyond recognition, carrying answers that technology can approach only with patience. The lake holds more than geology. It also holds memory in its most tangible form. The ancestors of the Tūhoto and Ngati Rangitihi Iwi remain connected to the place where the eruption claimed their lives. The same deposits that shield the terraces also embrace villages, homes, and those who never returned from that night. Any future decision about direct access must acknowledge that these realities occupy the same ground. Scientific curiosity and cultural responsibility meet at the same point beneath the water, and neither can be separated from the other. Life has continued across every generation since the eruption. The descendants of guide Sophia still carry her story. The words attributed to Tūhoto Ariki remain part of the historical record surrounding those final days before the mountain awakened. At Te Wairoa, archaeologists continue uncovering ordinary belongings left behind during the eruption. A child's toy, fragments of household pottery, tools, clothing, and building materials emerge from layers of ash after more than a century. Each discovery shortens the distance between the present and one winter night that has never entirely released its hold upon the landscape. Elsewhere within the same volcanic system, change continues without interruption. Waimangu Geyser belongs to history, remembered through measurements and photographs. Frying Pan Lake still releases heat from the earth below. Inferno Crater Lake continues its repeating cycle of rising and falling, following rhythms established by the geothermal system that survived the eruption in altered form. Every spring, vent, crater, and steaming shoreline reflects another expression of the same restless engine that shaped this region long before people arrived. Nothing can restore the world that existed before the morning of June 10th, 1886. Even so, that world has not disappeared entirely. It endures within ash preserved beneath the forest floor, inside the diary of an Austrian geologist rediscovered in a Swiss library, across the canvases of Charles Blomfield, within the names Te Tarata and Te Otukapuarangi, and in the continuing work of those who study, protect, and remember this place. The eruption belongs to history, yet its consequences continue unfolding. In that sense, the night has never completely passed. It still moves through the mountain, the lake, the people, and the enduring search to understand what remains. There is a place beneath Lake Rotomahana where sunlight no longer reaches. The water carries its own weight through the depths, settling over volcanic mud, broken stone, and the shapes that generations believed had vanished forever. Somewhere within that buried landscape, the pink and white terraces remain, changed by time, concealed by sediment, yet still part of the earth that created them. Since the morning of June 10th, 1886, the lake has continued its patient work. Fine volcanic particles have drifted downward, layer after layer, covering the formations with a blanket laid down over more than a century. The water above them has never stopped moving. Heat still rises from the geothermal system below. Mineral-rich fluids continue their slow circulation through fractures in the rock. Nothing beneath the lake has stood apart from time. Everything has continued to change, even beyond human sight. The terraces were shaped across roughly 7,000 years. Their burial unfolded within 6 hours. Those numbers describe more than a dramatic contrast. They reveal the different rhythms through which the planet creates and transforms its landscapes. Human history measures generations. Geological history measures processes that continue whether anyone observes them or not. The system that formed the terraces has not reached an ending. It has only entered another chapter that extends beyond the span of any single lifetime. Far below the surface, new minerals continue collecting around underwater vents. Sediment settles grain by grain across older deposits. Heat rises from the magma system that still powers the geothermal field. If that system remains active across another 7,000 years, and if groundwater, chemistry, landscape, and time align once again, new silica formations may begin growing somewhere within the basin. They would belong to another age, shaped by another landscape, carrying a history entirely their own. No person living today will witness such a beginning. No language now spoken can preserve the memory of its completion. Like the original terraces, any future formation would spend almost all of its existence beyond human attention. It would grow, because physical laws permit it to grow. It would require no audience, no artist, and no visitor to justify its existence. That truth reaches beyond this single lake. The natural world does not wait for discovery before becoming real. Forests mature without applause. Coral reefs assemble their limestone cities beneath waves few people cross. Mountains rise, fracture, and wear away according to forces that owe nothing to observation. The terraces belong to that larger pattern from the beginning. Their beauty was never dependent upon those who traveled across oceans to admire it. Today, they remain where the earth has chosen to keep them. Their exact condition is still uncertain. Their future is still undecided. The volcano above them remains active. The geothermal system continues its work. The lake still carries warmth upward from the same source that once filled every pool with mineral-rich water. Beneath that water, the story continues without conclusion. The earth has not forgotten what it made. It has only folded it back into itself, where creation and change have always belonged.